In this lesson, we're going to continue to explore the different data functions that Excel 2013 has to offer. We will discuss the is functions, including is_err and is_error, the if_error function and the offset function, how to create a dynamic range using the offset function, and how to create a dynamic formula using the indirect function, how to deal with indirect function errors, and the cell function. In Excel 2013, the is functions return logical true or false values. Is functions are used to get information regarding a value before it takes another action, such as solving a formula. We have already used the is_na and is_ref functions in this course to find out about a value before solving a formula. In conjunction with if statements, we told Excel what we wanted to appear on the screen if the outcome was true or if it was false. In short, is functions check for errors. As we've said, the is function checks for errors. Now let's take a look at how to use them. Have a look at our worksheet here. In this example, we have 4 different parts that were sold. The sales total column shows the dollar amount earned from all sales. The sold column shows how many were sold. In the average column, we've entered a formula to produce the average price per product sold. Let's press enter and then complete the average for each part. If we remove a value from the sold column, we'll get an error message. Excel is letting us know that we're trying to divide by 0. To prevent us from seeing those unattractive error messages, we can use the is_error function to check for errors as we calculate formulas. Instead of entering B2 minus C2 as we did in this cell here, we will instead enter the is_err function along with the formula. If there's an error, we want the dash to appear. If there's not an error, we want Excel to calculate the formula and display the results. Let's look at how we enter it. First we enter the equals if formula and then the is_err function. Then we enter the formula we want to calculate. Then we close the brackets, then a comma. What we've said is if there's an error when you divide B2 by C2, we need to work out what to do. Next we tell Excel what to do. If it's true and there is an error, we want Excel to display a dash. If it's false and there is not an error, we want Excel to calculate the formula and display the results. Press enter and then finish completing the average for each product. The error message that was showing for part B is now a dash. The is_error function works in the same way. You can then finish the worksheet by dragging the handle down in the lower right corner of the cell to fill the remaining cells here. As you can see, when there was an error, Excel returned a dash. You can find the is functions under the Formulas tab, in More Functions, then under the Information section. The if_error function is a shortcut to the is_err and is_error functions. With the if_error function, you simply enter if_error, then the parameters in brackets. The first parameter is the value that you want to test for an error. If we use the previous example, it's sales total divided by sold. Next is the value if the error. This is where you enter what you want displayed in the cell if an error is found. If you look at the worksheet, you'll see the if error put a dash in the cell where there's an error, once we expand it to all the cells here. The offset function returns the address of a cell or range of cells by using a reference cell. When you use the offset function, you select a range of cells that are the offset from the location. Let's take a look at the offset function in an actual worksheet to better understand the purpose it serves. Here is the worksheet. Now let's enter the formula. The first parameter asked for when you use an offset function is a reference. This is the starting point. After you enter the reference, Excel wants to know how many rows and columns offset from the starting point that you want to be. Let's choose our reference. Now we have to decide how many rows offset we want to be. This can be a positive or negative number. A positive number takes us down, a negative number takes us up. Let's use -1. This will move us up one cell on the worksheet. Next, enter the number of columns. A negative number will move to the left, and a positive number moves to the right. You can also enter 0 to stay in the same column. The final two parameters that you can enter are optional. They are the height and width. We'll talk about those in another example. You can also enter formulas for any of the parameters to perform a calculation that determines how far you want to move from the starting point. For now, let's add a closing bracket and press enter. If we count the cells from our starting point, which was this cell here, B3, we can see that it's one cell up and one cell to the right of the starting cell. In our example, we offset a single cell, which is returned the value of 18. If we want to offset an entire range, we'll use the height and width parameters we mentioned just a second ago. Let's take a look at how to do it. As you can see, we've expanded our worksheet. We start off with the same as we did with the last example by choosing the reference cell for our offset function. Now we offset by -2 rows and 1 column. However, now we're going to enter how many rows to include for the height and how many columns to include for the width. We've extended our range by 2 rows and 2 columns. The offset is now defining a range. Press enter. This causes us to get a value error because Excel doesn't know what to do with the range. To eliminate the error, the range can be embedded in a sum. It can also be embedded in any other type of function, such as count, min, or max. Let's put this inside a sum function. We now get the total of 54. 54 is the sum of the 4 cells selected that define our range. These 4 cells here were included as part of the range because we moved 2 cells up and 1 cell to the right. Then we included 2 column width and 2 height for the range. At first glance, it's easy to wonder in what situation you would ever use an offset function. A real-world example of using offset function is to create a dynamic named range, as we're going to show you how to do. Take a look at our invoice here. We used this invoice in an earlier lesson to create a VLOOKUP to produce the product ID. If you also remember, we named our data range in our products worksheet that you can see here. However, when we tried to add a new product at the end of the range, Excel didn't include it in the named range. As a result, we couldn't enter it into our invoice. At the same time, we decided to insert the new row in the middle of the existing row so that it would be included in our named data range. Now, we're going to solve that problem. We're going to use the offset function to make it so our named range dynamically increases in size. This means if we add a new row to the bottom of the named range will automatically expand. Our named range is currently titled Products. Let's learn to turn it into a dynamically named range. Click the Name Manager button under the Formulas tab. We've clicked on Products. Go down to the Refers To field at the bottom of the dialog box. It's there that we can start to enter our offset function. The first thing we add is our reference. Our reference is our worksheet since this is the worksheet in our product list. This is titled Sheet 4. We put an exclamation point to let Excel know we are referencing the worksheet. Then we put the cell that we're referencing, which is the very first cell in the worksheet. Now we have to tell Excel how many rows we'd like to move. We want to enter 0. We also want to enter 0 for the number of columns. We're not trying to offset the starting point. Instead, we're using it to highlight a range. Now we have to enter the height, or how many rows. Instead of trying to count them all on the worksheet, we'll use the count A function. The count A function counts the number of cells that have data. We're going to specify that it count the number of cells in column A. Next we add in the width, or the number of columns. We can use another count_a function, but since in our example we are unlikely to add columns, we're just going to add the number, which is 4. Now we close the bracket. Press the green checkmark button to the left of the formula, then press close. Now if we add our rows to the product list, it would automatically be included in our dynamic named range. There might be times when you don't have the actual cell to reference, but you have a cell with the reference to the actual cell in it. This is where you would use the indirect function. That may sound confusing. To show you what we mean, let's have a look at our worksheet. In this cell here, we'll type in the value D3. We want the value of cell D3 to appear in L5, which is the cell we've highlighted here. The easiest thing to do, especially in very large worksheets, would be to use cell L4 to reference cell D3. Let's try to do that. As you can see, Excel returns D3. That's not what we want. We want the value of the reference cell. To get that, we would use an indirect function. The first parameter is the reference, which is cell L4, as you can see here. Next, you can decide the optional parameters. As you can see, we can choose either false or true. False means that what we reference will be interpreted as R1, C1, or row 1, column 1. True means it will be interpreted as A1, which is a cell. We want true since we're referencing a cell. True is the default choice, so you don't need to actually enter true. You can just enter a closing bracket if you want. Press enter. You can see the value of cell D3 is now in L5. We can now change the cell reference in L4 here, and it will display the value of cell in L5. Indirect functions can be used inside other functions as well. You can also use them to select and create whole ranges. Let's say we want to add a range of cells. The start cell, or where we want the range to start, is B2. The end cell, or where we want the range to end, is D7. This will effectively add total sales for Q1. We've just entered the start and end cells into this worksheet. Now let's enter it into another cell. First we start with the sum formula. Then we use indirect. Then we have a colon and then another indirect formula. In this example, we've used sum, but you can use any function that you want. We've instructed Excel to add the values of the cells referenced in those two cells here, B2 and D7. This is the total of our Q1 sales. If you want, you can double check this by adding up the totals in the Q1 column. It shows the same value. Now we can go back to these two cells here and change the cell references. Let's say we want the total for Q2, which would be from F2 to H7. This gives us 347, which we can double check by totaling this column. With indirect functions, if you add a cell reference that's not actually a cell reference, you'll see a ref error. For example, instead of entering F2 as our starting point, we've just entered F. That's not actually a cell reference. A cell reference needs a row and a column. We get the ref error message. We can use the if error function that we learned about earlier in this lesson to determine what is displayed if there is a ref error. All we need to do is enter the if error before our indirect function, and then specify the message that's displayed there if there is an error. Now press enter. You can see there's a dash that's been displayed if there's an error. Let's use a simpler example so you can see exactly how the if error function is added. Let's use our earlier example when we simply reference cell D3. Except we're going to make it so that we get an error. Let's change this to just the letter D. Now we have our ref error. Let's add in an if error function around that. We've essentially told Excel that if there is an error with the indirect function, display a dash. We've learned how to create dynamic formulas and dynamic named cell ranges. However, we can also dynamically determine the name of a workbook or worksheet by using the cell function. Let's start by dynamically generating the name of the workbook. In the worksheet, we're going to use the cell function. When we start to enter the cell function, we notice that it gives us a lot of information from which to choose. We're going to name our new workbook, so we'll choose the file name. We'll add a sheet name later, but that has to be calculated. Now we can add a reference, which is yet an optional parameter. If you haven't noticed yet, optional parameters always open and close in square brackets. Enter the closing bracket and then press return. We can see the path to the file. Using the cell function, we returned the file path. Now we'll create a dynamic formula to extract the sheet name from that path. To do so, we're going to need to enter a different formula. Take note of the different functions we've used: mid, cell, find, and length. Now press enter. When we do, we can see the name of our worksheet displayed in the cell. If you rename the worksheet in the tab, the worksheet name in the cell will also change. Next, let's say we want to see the name of the workbook. We know how to display the path, but we just want to see the file name, or the workbook name. Let's enter a new formula. You can see that that cell now shows the file name. Here is a list of some other information you can choose with the cell function. Col displays the column number of the reference cell. You need a cell reference for this. Remember, the cell reference was optional with the workbook name. If you reference cell C3, Excel will display 3. C is the third letter in the alphabet. Row displays the row number of the reference cell. Again, you'll need a cell reference. Width displays the width of the reference cells in pixels. Address displays the absolute address of the reference cell. Color displays the value 1 if the cell is formatted in color for negative values, otherwise it shows 0. Contents displays the value of the upper left cell in the reference. Format displays a text value that corresponds to the number format of the cell. Parentheses displays a 1 if the reference cell is formatted with parentheses for a positive or all values, otherwise it's 0. Prefix displays a text value that corresponds to the label prefix of a cell. Protect displays 1 if a cell is locked, otherwise it displays 0. And type displays a text value that corresponds to the type of data that's in a cell. B is returned for blank or empty cells. L is returned if it contains a text constant, and V is returned for all other types of cell content.